They were self-governing colonies ignored by the mother country year after year until new laws were passed to bring them under control. Now they were breaking the law and meant to keep on breaking it. The American Revolution, this time on the Western tradition. In 1492, Columbus found a new land across the Atlantic, or at least a land new for Europeans. And the world of Western man was increased by 2 continents. Then in 1507, a German map maker published a map of the world incorporating the new discoveries, and he called the new lands America, after Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator in the service of Spain. He could have called them Columbia after Columbus. But America, the new lands, remained. And the American dream was born to fire the imagination of those who didn't like the reality they saw around them in Europe, the violence and the corruption of the old world. In America, naked savages shared what they possessed. They had simple needs. They led harmonious lives. They were naturally good. America was a world that had escaped the fall. It had never known original sin. It was a golden world, truly golden, because it was full of treasure. Gold, silver, land for the taking, not to mention tobacco. The happy noble savage never existed, of course, and those inhabitants who did exist were soon wiped out by war, disease, and exploitation. But noble American savages peopled European utopias from the 16th century to the 20th. American utopia became a part of European consciousness. In the great open plains, American life was seen as closer to God and nature, simpler, more human. You could enjoy the purity of pioneer life, grappling with nature, coming to terms with it. You could find not just treasure, but freedom, liberty, true democracy. These concepts have haunted the European imagination since the first discoveries, and they've become part of the political rhetoric of America itself. Freedom and democracy were going to take a little time, however, because the first dream of America was really about riches. It was the hope of riches that drove hard, cruel, persistent men to conquer and settle new lands across the Atlantic, to fight over them, to kill, loot, exploit, enslave, finally to organize new societies on the ruins of what they found and took. The new societies came first in South America and the Caribbean, where Spain founded an extraordinary empire. The empire was bureaucratic, prosperous, stable, sophisticated, no more oppressive than Spain, less heavily taxed than Spain, more advanced than Spain, and certainly more advanced than the less attractive lands to the north. Where the north was muddy villages, the south was an urban culture. This, for instance, is Mexico City. The north was logs, the south was stone. Fine cities, great churches, universities, and libraries. There was also a social life to match Milan or Madrid, a merchant class to match Lisbon or Seville, and public money for urban improvement, for paving, lighting, water supply, for planting trees along broad avenues. Some of the Baroque masterpieces of the 1700s are still standing in Mexico City. But by the 1700s, the Spanish Empire was declining, and the South declined with it. A new world was rising in the North. It had taken the North a long time to catch up. By the 1530s, when the French first sailed up the St. Lawrence River, the Spaniards were already well ensconced in Mexico, Peru, and Cuba. By the 1580s, when the English settled Newfoundland and tried to settle Virginia, which they named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Spanish universities in Lima and Mexico were already turning out more officials than Padua or Paris. There was no treasure in the north to attract colonists. There were furs, but you don't need a lot of people to trap animals and skin them. And the native Indians in the north were more warlike than those in the south. So really, the settlement of the North American continent didn't come until the 17th century. That's when the French founded Quebec and Montreal, and the English refounded Virginia. That's when the Pilgrims took 3 months and 5 days to sail from Plymouth in England to New Plymouth in what eventually became Massachusetts. The 17th century is when the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in what is now New York, when the Swedes founded New Sweden in what is now Delaware, and when John Locke wrote a constitution for the new state of Carolina, which was named, of course, after King Charles I. Tom Paine was going to call America the colony of all of Europe. Indeed, by the 18th century, America was attracting Welsh and Scots, Spaniards and Germans and Austrians to go along with the French and English and Dutch. And America was also a European colony in the sense that its new culture was European. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, for example, they had signed a covenant, which was a true social contract. They constituted themselves a civil body politic, they said, and they promised obedience to the just and equal laws that shall be thought meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. And so America was the colony of the European tradition of humanism and creativity born in the Renaissance, and culminating in the 18th century Enlightenment spirit. A spirit that the American myth and American possibilities fit very, very well. You can get an idea of this spirit when you go to Virginia and look at the extraordinary wilderness home that a young Virginia lawyer built himself in the 1760s. The lawyer's name was Thomas Jefferson, and he called his house Monticello, the Little Mountain. Jefferson made the plans for Monticello with the aid of a book of designs by the great Renaissance architect Palladio, whose 16th century creations you can still admire in northeast Italy. Palladio was coming back in vogue in the 18th century because his lines are the epitome of reason and harmony, symmetrical, proportional, never cold or dull or grandly stodgy. Some of the great buildings of 18th century England are Palladian or Neo-Palladian, but you wouldn't expect a Palladian mansion on the edge of Indian territory. Yet, that is what you get at Monticello, designed and built by a man who was as much a universal man as Alberti was in the Renaissance. Linguist, scientist, farmer, educator, town planner, and architect, horseman and musician, and since he was American, Jefferson was typically fond of technological improvements and gadgets. At Monticello, doors open when you approach them, a clock tells the days of the week, and the master's bed is placed so he can get out of it in either of two rooms. The American landscape may still have been wild in the 18th century, but a society that could produce a Jefferson was highly sophisticated, which also meant that it wasn't exactly poor any longer. Both the British and French colonies and their trade were now worth fighting for. They may not have been as important as the West Indies, which produced sugar and coffee and tobacco, and which both the British and the French thought worth far more than Canada, which Voltaire described as a few acres of snow, and far more than the wilderness around the Ohio River, but they were still worth fighting for. In fact, the great 18th century wars between France and England were really about who was going to rule the seas and therefore command the colonies, because by then the crux of trade and wealth and power was seen as being overseas. So the British fought the French for world power, and in that fight the British colonials in America helped their fellow British against the French and against the Indians who fought on the side of the French. It was in these French and Indian wars that men like George Washington got their military experience. By this time, the colonials had started to call themselves Americans, and they were glad when the Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced the French out of Canada, because that meant the French would no longer hamper their own movement westward. Nor would the French be there to arm and support the Indians to withstand the colonial advance into Indian territories. But when the French had been pushed out, the British, who had been seen as protectors, now began to appear as oppressors, or at least as a nuisance. Because the British didn't want trouble from their disobedient American children, they didn't want the Americans pushing into Indian lands and starting conflicts that would cost money. And even worse, the British, depicted here haughtily regarding a map of North America, the British wanted to tax Americans for services they, the British, provided, services which Americans now felt they could provide by themselves. The British wanted to harness the colonial economy to the interests of the home country. They wanted to control trade in the old mercantilistic way when the Americans were free traders. So, almost as soon as the Treaty of Paris had been signed, British and Americans started to squabble, and within 12 years, they started to fight. That was the American Revolution. The American Revolution has sometimes been called 10 years of wrangling and 8 years of war. But actually the roots of the revolution were planted with the first English settlements in America. There are books which emphasize the fact that nearly half the history of this country concerns a period of dependence on Great Britain. This is true, of course, but it also gives a false impression. Because on the one hand, American cultural dependence on Europe in general and on England in particular was not restricted to the colonial period, but went on much longer than that. And on the other hand, it would be quite possible to argue that the American colonies were pretty much politically independent from the very beginning. For the most part, the colonial period is the story of self-governing colonies which were ignored by the mother country for decade after decade. Then, rather late in the day, and as it seemed to the colonists rather suddenly, an attempt was made to tighten things up, to get some effective control over colonial affairs through administration and taxation. The attempt failed, very much as a parent would fail if he or she tried to control a grown child that had never known any discipline. Furthermore, 17th and 18th century England was politically divided. It was torn by civil wars in the 1600s. It was torn by rebellions in the early 1700s. The English never were terribly interested in administering and controlling their colonies, and when they did try to control them, that aroused resentment. So the English drew back. By necessity or policy, colonial relations were oiled by salutary neglect, by letting sleeping dogs lie. And this left its mark on the colonists. It made it hard to order them around. You can drift into a policy, but habit becomes custom and establishes a sort of prescriptive right. There is a story that illustrates this point. 60 years after the Revolution, a man by the name of Levi Preston, who had been a Minuteman in Massachusetts and who was by now a kind of historical curiosity. Preston was asked about the English oppression, so-called, which had started, presumably, all the trouble. Oppressions, he said, what were they? I didn't feel any. Well, there was the Stamp Act. Stamp Act? I never saw any stamps. How about the tea tax? Well, I never drank a cup of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Well, then there were Sidney and Locke on the eternal principles of liberty. Never heard of them. We read only the Bible, the Catechism, Watts' hymns, and the Almanac. Well then, says the interviewer, what the dickens did you go into this fight for? Young men, says Preston, what we meant was this. We always had governed ourselves, we always meant to govern ourselves, they didn't mean we should. Now this conversation, I think, gives us a clear idea of one rather unexpected aspect of the American Revolution, that revolutions don't have to be caused by revolutionary ideas. The American Revolution was a conservative affair. It was fought by some people to resist further change. You might say to resist change and progress in the shape of the growing efficiency and the growing power of the British state. The beginning of the argument between the colonists and the London government was legalistic. The British imposed a tax, and the colonists said you can't impose this sort of tax, it's unconstitutional. And so the British would withdraw the first tax and impose another sort of tax that was just as odious as the first. And when the tax agent kept coming, Bostonians poured tea down his throat after tarring and feathering him. The point, of course, was that the colonists did not choose to pay taxes or to suffer restrictions for the sake of an empire that they no longer needed. It was not in their interest to pay taxes, and you couldn't suppose that they would be such very peculiar people as to sacrifice self-interest to sentiment. They were breaking the law because they didn't like the law and because they felt strong enough to break it, and they meant to go on breaking it, but what they wanted was a good excuse for doing so, a rationalization, a justification of their stand. And so they started to talk a bit less about their rights as free-born Englishmen, and they started to talk a bit more about their natural rights as members of the human race. Natural law was much safer ground. It was ambiguous, it was fashionable, and it was just what American patriots needed. Natural law was moral, since it was based on a faith in God and in the perfection of His creation. It denied authority to any government which didn't rest on the consent of the governed. And it was, so to speak, in the air. It didn't have to be argued, it didn't have to be justified. People usually accepted it whole as a self-evident truth. Even so, the revolutionary argument did not rest wholly on natural rights alone. In fact, to start with, the revolutionary leaders had some trouble in deciding which rights they were defending, whether they were British rights or human rights. So they tried a bit of everything. The revolutionary leaders couldn't decide either whether the oppressor was King George or the Parliament. There were appeals for relief from the oppression of the king, which they addressed to Parliament. There were appeals for relief from the oppression of Parliament, which they addressed to the king. There were appeals based on colonial charters, which they addressed to the courts. There were also appeals to the classic virtues dear to the 18th century, and one Rhode Island patriot urged fellow Rhode Islanders to awaken, as he put it, all that is Roman in Providence. Arguments, however, don't make revolutions or win wars. The Revolutionary War was possible because the colonists were too far away for the British to repress the rebellion with the means available at the time. And the war was won because the enemies of England had an interest in helping the colonists who rebelled against her. The French especially were delighted to pay the English back for the loss of Canada. They supplied the insurgents with tens of thousands of muskets. Most of the gunpowder they used came from France. And finally, after the Americans had demonstrated that they weren't going to give in, the French came into the war and they provided the military and naval support that actually won it. And if you want to know what Europeans thought the war was about, you have only to look where the peace was signed. Not in Boston, not in London, but in Versailles in 1783. That was the last victory of the French monarchy, and this painting was never finished, by the way, because the British refused to pose. So what Americans called the War of Independence was only won after a long struggle in which French aid and British incompetence were crucial, and in which the result was largely a matter of European power politics. Largely, but not entirely, for if in the end the colonists won, it was also because at the end of the 18th century, the economic principles on which the old colonial system rested were being discarded by Adam Smith and his followers in Britain, by a new generation of economists and philosophers in France. Out of the Enlightenment, a new philosophy of economic liberalism was rising over the West, a philosophy opposed to mercantilism and state regulation, a philosophy that taught that the wealth of nations was to be found in free trade, freedom of individual enterprise and competition, and the abolition of old restrictive laws of trade and navigation. And this movement of economic liberalism was part of the general 18th century movement of humanitarian and rationalistic reform in Europe, which meant that the economic reformers had made common cause with moralistic reformers who refused to sanction the coercion or oppression of subject peoples, including the colonists in America. So here you had a coalition between English businessmen who felt confident enough not to want a closed colonial market, and an English public confident enough to sympathize with moral and philosophical appeals, which meant that the English were deeply divided on the colonial issue. And the ones who stood for a hard policy towards the American rebels belonged mostly to the stupid party, as we can see from their conduct of the war, when over and over again it wasn't really the Americans who won, it was the English who lost. Next time, the influence of the American Revolution on Europe. Until then. One feared tyranny and sought a government that would not intrude upon the lives of people. The other feared the mob and wanted a government that would make people behave. As both men fought and struggled to build a nation, Europe dreamed of paradise across the Atlantic. The American Republic, this time on the Western tradition. Given the incompetence of English soldiers and politicians in the American War of Independence, given French aid, given factors like distance and a large measure of luck, we can furnish some explanations of how the colonists finally won. But then, when the fighting was over, we can also see the development of conflict in the American camp between moderates and radicals, between the conservatives, the stabilizers, and the Party of Change and Movement. It was, in essence, a classic revolutionary situation after the revolution was over. One group was made up largely of the early revolutionary leaders who had been quite willing to go to war to get independence, men like Jefferson or Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. These people liked the Articles of Confederation that had been agreed on during the war because they were pretty loose and ineffective, and because they embodied the conviction that the greatest political gain of the revolution was the independence of the several states. The weaker the Confederation was, the more independent the states were. The more independent the states were, the better they liked it. The men who opposed this group had on the whole come into the revolution more reluctantly. Men like Alexander Hamilton or Robert Livingston of New York. Most of them believed that the new nation should have a central government with power to coerce both the state government and the citizens. They were conservative in their politics, they were conservative in their social standing, men of principle and men of property, whose property sometimes provided a major principle. These two tendencies, these two attitudes, are best represented by two personalities, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And they are reflected in two documents: the Declaration of Independence, the idealistic proclamation that makes a revolution, and the Constitution, the legalistic document that is the product of compromise and of fear of further revolution. Obviously, the two attitudes were at opposite poles. There could be little compromise between those who felt that man needs only to be freed from his chains in order to move towards perfection, and those who felt that even the wisest and the strongest bars could not keep a man from making a damn fool of himself and making his neighbor miserable as well. When they looked into the future, Jefferson and his followers feared the corruptions of power. They believed that if man was saved from tyranny, he would do very well for himself, so they were for a government that would do as little as possible. When Hamilton and his followers looked into the future, they feared the corruptions of human nature. They believed that if man was saved from himself, there was a great future for American society. Naturally, they were for an active, interfering government that would make things happen the way they should happen, that would make people behave the way they should behave. People who were of this mind argued that the attempt at a loose government based on the Articles of Confederation was a failure, and they eventually had their way at the cost of a few compromises at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. So, while we can say symbolically that Jefferson, in the sense of the ideas he represented, that Jefferson made the revolution, we can also say with lots of reservations that Hamilton made the Constitution. And that to a certain extent, the interesting thing about the American experiment is that it has always preserved this combination of hard-headed practice on the lines of Hamilton and Hobbes, and very idealistic theory on the lines of Jefferson and Locke. So, while all men were created equal, this didn't include blacks who could not marry whites, Indians who were to be driven off their lands, illiterates and paupers who weren't going to get a vote, and women, of course, who were not men. The Constitution replaced the old authority by a new one, the old monarchical ruling class by a new republican ruling class resting on property and social distinction, and eventually on heredity too, as much as the old one had done. The big difference was that Americans could not admit the hereditary and social distinctions on which their society, like every other society, was based. And this created a gap between theory and practice, between the theory of equality that united the nation and the practice of competition, competition with its unequal and selective results that kept the nation on the move and made it expand. The tension between theory and practice, between equality and competition, this tension would never be admitted, let alone resolved. The frauds and the illusions necessary to conceal it became part of American history and of history itself. And it's quite possible that without such great illusions and great deceptions too, no great nation can exist, at least not as a nation. If we look to see how this worked out in immediate practice, we glimpse first of all a belief in the great destiny of the new nation and a general conviction that Americans could do anything they wanted to, untrammeled by the traditions and the repressions of the old world. And nowhere was this feeling as strong as in the old world itself. Because America was a screen on which Europe could project its own ideal visions. Europe was divided and restless within itself. It was rent by the clash between the established ideas of inherited family status and privilege and the new ideas of personal merit. There was a growing demand for equality. There was growing social mobility, but not nearly enough. And that made for a more troubled class consciousness. At the same time, there was a growing elitism in Europe, both in the developing bureaucracies and in the aristocratic reaction of a class that felt threatened and reacted by asserting itself more strongly than before. And this conflicted with a vague but widespread desire among a lot of people who had been outside the political scene up to now. A desire to take part in affairs, to do good for society, to play the patriot, to act the citizen the way people like themselves had shown was possible in the new United States. And it was to America that everybody referred, from Scotland to Poland, sometimes in the most unrealistic terms. The indifference to fact being a kind of mirror of the feelings of the author, of the painter. A mirror, too, of the distance that turned the American continent into a mirage. They say, writes a Belgian in 1782, they say that in Virginia the members chosen to establish the new government assembled in a peaceful wood removed from the sight of the people, in an enclosure prepared by nature with banks of grass. And that in this sylvan spot they deliberated on who should preside over them. And here is something more heroic but equally silly from a Frenchman with strong echoes of Plutarch and the noble Romans. The day when Washington resigned his command in the Hall of Congress, a crown set with jewels had been placed on the book of the Constitution. Suddenly, Washington seized the crown, broke it, and threw the pieces before the assembled people. How petty does the ambitious Caesar seem before this hero of America. Of course, this is a sort of fairy tale. Here we see a far more likely version of the event, but under the literary artifice and the rhetoric you can find a kind of spiritual emigration. You can sense the psychological discomfort of Europeans, the yearning to live in a better country where solid merit would be recognized, the moral rejection of existing European society, which would be the ultimate cause of revolution there. In Europe, we're told, talent can be a sad and futile gift, but in America, the most honest, the most truly respectable was also the greatest and the most respected without reference to birth or rank. In America, there were none of the social injustices that were weighing more heavily in Europe, not because they were getting heavier, but because people were more aware of them than ever before. In America, artificial distinctions had been brushed away. As a German professor put it in 1776, the Americans are the most fortunate people on the whole earth, at least among civilized nations. They do not even know the names of many burdens borne by subjects in Europe. The professor couldn't understand why half of Europe hadn't already emigrated across the Atlantic. Of course, there were people, and Jefferson was one who tried to combat the more absurd ideas about America that circulated in Europe. But the realists were opposed by those Europeans who preferred dreams to reality, and indeed who saw that if you wanted to affect reality, only dreams could provide truly striking material. You wish, sir, to destroy this enchantment, says a Frenchman in 1786. Cruel man! Even if it were an illusion, would you still dissipate it? It would be dear to us. It would be useful in consoling the man of virtue. And he might have added, it would be useful too in showing what you could do and what you could get if you tried your own revolution. What you had here was frustration translated into boundless hope. And this feeling produced a kind of philosophy of history, the belief that the American Revolution marked an enormous turning point in the entire history of the human race. One of the most revered of American public documents, the dollar bill, bears on its reverse the date 1776 and the inscription Novus Ordo Seclorum, which means that in that fateful year, 1776, not only was a new nation born, but a new order of human society, free from the sins and the follies of the old Europe. The proof of that lay in the fact that George Washington did not become king when the war was over, but returned to his farm at Mount Vernon, which proved that Republicans really were virtuous men like ancient Romans or enlightened philosophers. When Virginia wanted to honor its great Republican hero, it hired the favorite sculptor of the Enlightenment, the Frenchman Houdon. His statue of Washington now stands in the Virginia state capitol at Richmond, in a building designed by Thomas Jefferson. This is what Tom Paine had to say about the new Republican spirit. what we formerly called revolutions were little more than a change of persons or an alteration of local circumstances. They rose and fell like things of course and had nothing in their existence or their fate that could influence beyond the spot that produced them. But what we now see in the world, from the revolutions of America and France, are a renovation of the natural order of things, a system of principles as universal as truth and the existence of man, and combining moral with political happiness and national prosperity. The extraordinary thing about this passage is that it was to a great extent true. And the main point on which Paine seems to be mistaken is not in getting excited about the significance of the American Revolution, but in classing it together with the French Revolution. The American Revolution was different both from that of 17th century England and from that of 18th century France, because it took place in a new country and a new world which were not set. And this meant that for once the exalted hopes of the revolutionary idealists were matched by the vast resources of an unexploited continent and by unlimited possibilities of social expansion and experiment. The American leaders had the opportunity to build, not just to fight. In 18th century France, Thomas Jefferson might have put together declarations and constitutions, but he would probably have gone to the guillotine like a lot of revolutionaries. In America, he was able not only to play the big part he did in the formulation of American political thought, but also an effective part as a practical politician in the government and the development of his country. When Jefferson died on July the 4th, 1826, which was also the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson died, he left precise instructions about what should be inscribed on his tomb. He wanted the inscription to say that he had fathered the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the University of Virginia. That's a very American, a very 18th century American selection, coming from a man who had done a lot of other things in his life, including being President of the United States, which he had helped to found. Jefferson's inclusion of the Statute for Religious Freedom is particularly telling. I don't know another revolutionary particularly interested in freedom of thought for others. And I also don't know another revolutionary who founded a university and designed it himself in 1816 as what he called an academic village, with individual quarters for students and professors, with gardens, and with a courtyard surrounded by elegant neoclassical buildings, but open on one side to the mountains and the land. On the other hand, this is the man who thought that a little revolution was good now and then, and who wrote that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is natural manure. He wrote that in 1787, just a few years before the French Revolution produced a bit too much blood manure. But still, it's remarkable that this man who would become president could be so forthright. Now, have you ever asked yourselves, in the light of what you know about politics, how Jefferson managed to survive and prosper politically for so long? Was it only by occasionally eating his words? Or was it rather because here in America, and here alone, his conception of democracy as a free commonwealth of freeholders liberated from the economic and political servitudes of the old world, free to exploit the resources of this new world. Here alone, all this was not just a utopian dream. It was a practical policy which could appeal, which did appeal to the Virginia planters, to the Pennsylvania Democrats, to the men on the frontier. And in addition, it was a possible policy, because the new United States inherited in its turn the privileged position of the country it had defeated. America too, and even more so, could be an island like England, inefficient, little governed, and remarkably free. It could do pretty much as it pleased without much interference from outside. American democracy was rude, its structure was clumsy, its politics were wasteful, but it worked. Or so it seemed to foreign observers like the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to see it in 1831 when the Union was half a century old, and who thought he found here the shape of things to come. And the American democracy didn't just work, it moved. After 1850, the United States had reached its present continental limits. After 1853, when the railroad reached Chicago and St. Louis, only Alaska and Hawaii would be missing from the present constellation of states. In this expanding land, where every 10th man or woman was an immigrant, a new nationalism was taking shape. We've listened too long to the refined muses of Europe, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson. We shall walk on our own feet. We shall work with our own hands. We shall speak according to our own convictions. And these recurrent declarations of independence also were part of the American syndrome, of what became an American tradition. So there it was. For nearly 3 centuries, the Western world had been in bondage to Europe. Now one portion of it was free, and within a few decades, the vast dominions of Spain and Portugal would also be free from their European masters, if not free from themselves. In April 1789, Washington, the first president of the new republic, took office 6 days before the French Estates General opened at Versailles, the prelude to quite a different revolution. By 1801, Jefferson was inaugurated the 3rd president of the United States. It was he who directed the planning of the capital city to be named after Washington, a capital which would be laid out on rational, enlightened lines by a French engineer called L'Enfant, whose design would imitate the Romans after whom the new republicans modeled themselves: massive, dignified, virile, and rather solemn. Washington architecture was supposed to reflect the power of the laws being forged there and the solidity of the new republic. And certainly there was something quite exceptional about what it stood for then. And it remains exceptional today, nearly 2 centuries later. Jefferson planned it well. Although he was buried at Monticello, the Jefferson Memorial in Washington quotes the words of the declaration he was so proud of. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. In our next program, we shall see how these words echoed throughout Europe with very different results from those they had in the United States. Until then. In every aspect of life, new ideas and new values were taking over in France. Even Louis XVI supported the American Revolution. These were the people who lit the fuse, the educated, the better off. And these were the people who exploded. The death of the old regime, this time on the Western tradition. The American Revolution that I talked about last time deserves our attention not only for its own sake, but also because it was the first of a long series of revolutions that were to mark the years from 1776 onwards, a series that isn't over yet. And the revolution was doubly significant because the men and the women who made it and those who got involved in it managed to solve its central problem in a way that makes it rather different from the other revolutions that we have seen since then. Revolution, you see, is rather like a snowball on a slope. It's not easy to get it going, but once it's on its way, it is hard to stop it rolling and growing until it becomes an avalanche. And the problem in America was to stop the revolution for independence from snowballing into a popular and democratic revolution. The Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation had marked the triumph of the democratic view, which favored popular sovereignty and little government. The Federalist Papers and the Constitution, on the other hand, marked a sort of counter-revolution of those who distrusted the people and who believed in strong government. To the Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, democracy was nearly anarchy. And the way to prevent power from slipping into the hands of an illiterate mob was to have government by the best people in the land, people like Hamilton himself, who could be trusted to use power in a moderate and responsible fashion. So at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, a constitution was designed that was democratic enough to be adopted, but not democratic enough to threaten the power and the controlling position of the upper and propertied classes. And this is what is so special, so unusual about the American Revolution, that it very soon stopped being a revolution, that the snowball was stopped before it became an avalanche. Even democratic leaders were able to indulge in the luxury of very revolutionary, very radical ideas while living and acting in a very conservative manner. It was possible to declare that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were inalienable rights of all men, and to provide legal protection for slavery. It was possible to declare that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, and to accept a constitution that did not provide for direct representation. So the American Revolution was ambivalent, both conservative and revolutionary. It could remain conservative because in relative terms, the conservatism of colonial Americans was more radical by the general standards of Europeans at the time. And conveniently, the deepest reactionaries in America, the loyalists who clung to king and empire and who might have forced a deeper radicalization by their intransigence, the loyalists left or were forced to leave, mostly for Canada. And those who remained could afford to remain relatively conservative, simply because the colonies had never known oppression, and because, as human institutions go, America always had been free, excepting, of course, for slavery. On the other hand, the American Revolution was revolutionary because the colonists took the risks of rebellion and because they checkmated those Americans who wanted a society like the aristocratic society of England and the rest of Europe. But most of all, the revolution was revolutionary because it showed how certain abstract doctrines, such as the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people, could be, as John Adams put it, could be reduced to practice by assemblies of pretty level-headed gentlemen exercising constituent power in the name of the people. The effects of all this on Europe were very important. The revolution inspired the sense of a new era. It added new substance to the concept of progress, a whole new dimension to the ideas of liberty and equality that the Enlightenment had spread abroad. It got people into the habit of thinking more concretely about political questions. It made them more readily critical of their own governments and their own system. It dethroned England as the inspiration of enlightened thinkers and set up America as the model for a better world. It brought written constitutions, declarations of rights, constituent conventions into the realm of the possible. Above all, perhaps, America made Europe seem unsatisfactory to a lot of people in the middle and the lower classes, and to those members of the upper classes who sympathized with them. It made a lot of Europeans feel sorry for themselves, and it induced a kind of spiritual flight from the old regime and from the values that it represented. But all this was happening in Europe, not in America. What it comes down to is that the American Revolution, in its doctrinal aspects, opened up the possibilities of political change, possibilities far wider than was necessary in practice in the America of 1776, but not in Europe. So while the formal example of revolution may have been given in Philadelphia, the effective example was going to be given in Paris. It was 1789 and the storming of the Bastille, not 1776, that set Europe on fire. And it is the French Revolution, not the American, which puts the question of the price of revolution, which gives us the certainty that there will always be a very high price to pay. And it leaves us wondering, when everything is said and done, whether even that high price will actually pay for the goods ordered, for the changes and advantages we might expect from revolution. In considering the French Revolution, the first thing we have to remember is how popular the very idea of revolution had become in Europe in this last quarter of the 18th century. You find village priests who keep the encyclopedia and the works of the philosophers on their bookshelves. You find laborers and peasants reading pamphlets about the new ideas, or being read to if they can't read themselves. You have the tremendous popularity of a man like Lafayette, returned from the American War to become a hero at home. And Benjamin Franklin, who becomes a kind of saint of the Enlightenment. And, of course, you have the philosophes. None of the philosophes actually advocated violent revolution, but their writings spread revolutionary ideas, and along with the books and pamphlets that were remaking the European mind, especially the French mind, there was propaganda for radical change heard in the fashionable salons of Paris, in cafes, and in societies of every kind which were founded in great numbers at this time. agricultural societies, philanthropical associations, provincial academies, correspondence societies, and reading rooms where people could not only read but talk. The Masonic lodges especially were favorable to philosophical infiltration because they had the same ideals as the philosophers: civil equality, religious toleration, the liberation of the human personality from all institutions that kept it immature. And the lodges didn't include just bourgeois, but priests and nobles and even the brothers of Louis XVI. Then there was the theatre. A playwright like Beaumarchais, whose patron was Queen Marie Antoinette. A man like Beaumarchais was busy writing subversive comedies like The Marriage of Figaro, which raised doubts about the value of noble birth. Marie Antoinette even acted in his plays for fun, while the king used Beaumarchais to supply arms to the American rebels, and in the hands of another Mason, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Figaro became the hero of an immensely popular opera, and Masonic ideas provided the core of an even greater opera, The Magic Flute. The virtues of humanity were also affirmed by a new interest in the necessary virtues of the citizen. And this went along with a revival of the classical models of good citizenship in Greece and especially Rome. You remember the Rhode Island patriot who wanted to awaken all that was Roman in Providence. Well, a lot of the rhetoric of 18th century revolution referred to the resolute and ruthless heroes of the Roman Republic who sacrificed themselves and everybody else in the interests of state and society. Some of the most effective propaganda in this line was produced by painters. And the most representative of these was probably Jacques-Louis David, the harbinger of revolution in art. In 1784, the year after the Peace of Paris ended the American Revolution, David painted a scene called the Oath of the Horatii that had been originally inspired by a tragedy of Corneille. The story of the three Horace brothers who go off to fight for Rome, swearing before their father that they're going to win or die. David's historical scenes were invariably manifestos for stoicism, courage, civic spirit. They were seen as an indictment of effete aristocratic ways and an advertisement for a return to the stern, patriotic morals of Republican Rome. So David became a culture hero, and in 1789 he painted another classical scene of Brutus, the Roman consul, receiving the corpses of his own sons whom he had condemned to death for treachery. It wasn't just the moral uplift, it wasn't just the political implication, it was also the setting and the costumes that made a strong statement for the simple virtues, for a sober architecture without curves or curlicues, for dress and furniture that were spare and simple and by implication virtuous. This had a tremendous impact on fashion. Virtue doesn't come easily, but dressing in a virtuous style does. So men cut their hair short in the Roman style, a la Brutus, and women adopted the dresses and the hairdos of Brutus's daughters, and eventually the really up-to-date adopted the very flimsy dresses that the Sabine women were supposed to have worn when Romans stole them away, with straight lines and practically no underwear, and the breasts exposed and nowhere to keep a hanky or a key, which in turn introduced another novelty, the ridicule or reticule, which was the ancestor of our handbags. So in every aspect of life, new values were taking over. Indeed, by the 1780s, these new values and ideas had been around so long that they didn't seem very new or very revolutionary. People were beginning to take them for granted. And even the people against whom they were directed, the aristocrats, were beginning to take them for granted. But they were playing with fire. Louis XVI, for instance, had supported the American rebels and helped them win their revolution. French noblemen like the Marquis de Lafayette had fought in the American army and had become heroes in France because they fought for a cause that the whole machinery of the French state was geared to crush at home. At the same time, the monarchy was growing weaker because its finances had been undermined by the cost of war across the Atlantic. The American Revolution had cost France the equivalent of 4 years' revenues. Most of this had been raised by borrowing. More than half of every year's budget had to go just to paying the interest on the debt. And all sorts of other things were going wrong. The weather was bad, the crops were bad, the price of bread was getting higher and higher. Wages stood still, prices went up, and so did the taxes that a desperate government trying to make ends meet was trying to squeeze out of the taxpayers. And since a lot of the French were not taxpayers, because nobles and clergy and officers of the crown didn't have to pay anything, the burden fell on the people least able to pay them. This last factor was very important because the mass of people would not have been stirred by theories if they hadn't been suffering in practice. And they were suffering terribly, even though the economic problems of France were not insuperable. These problems could have been solved, at least in part, by a government that knew its mind. The deficit could have been made up. The national debt could have been handled, but to do this, you had to break the privileges of the privileged. You had to break the privileges, especially of the clergy and the nobility. You had to make them pay taxes. You had to cut the pensions that were sucking the treasury dry. Just one family of royal favorites, the Polignacs, were getting pensions equivalent to 1.5% of the annual revenues of the crown for doing nothing, but for doing it very gracefully. If you could do away with pensions and tax exemptions, you could probably set the country's finances on an even keel. But of course, none of this was done. So here was a repetition in many ways of the situation in the American colonies. The French government, like the British, tried to tighten things up for the sake of efficiency and for greater revenues. And it was opposed at first by certain privileged groups, nobles, clergy, gentlemen, lawyers, and intellectuals. Although there was a background of discontent, it didn't have to explode unless the fuses were lit, and the people who lit them were, as in America, the better off people, the educated, who brandished slogans like liberty and natural law and representation in order to defend their privileges. The same thing was going on in other parts of Europe. In 1786, there was a revolution in Holland, which had to be put down by Prussian troops. In 1788, there was a revolution in Belgium. And there was unrest throughout the Habsburg Empire, and all were directed against governments that tried to disturb old traditions, old institutions, to attack privileges, to introduce more rational reforms, more efficient administration. And that's just what happened in France. The French government, under a fairly able Minister of Finance, Charles de Calonne, tried to rationalize the management of the country, tried to move into the modern age by abolishing the anachronistic survivals of the feudal system. But paradoxically, the government tried to do this by reviving an old feudal institution, the Estates General, a representative assembly that had met just once since 1500 and not at all since 1614. The government wanted to play the third estate, the commoners, against the privileged orders. But the ploy failed and the third estate took over, claiming quite rightly that it really represented the nation. It declared itself the National Assembly, and after a lot of talk, much of it foolish, the representatives of the nobility and the clergy joined them, and that, in June 1789, was the beginning of the constitutional revolution. Then, on the 4th of August, in a great burst of enthusiasm, the Assembly abolished the feudal order. The sitting opened with a Viscount proposing the abolition of all economic privileges, no more forced labor, no more personal serfdom, no more tax exemptions. A duke supported him strongly, and the proposals were voted with enthusiasm. And after this, all particular privileges were sacrificed on the altar of the fatherland. Hunting rights went the way of all flesh. Guilds and corporations were suppressed. The clergy gave up their tithes. The magistrates who bought their offices gave them up too. And this went on until 2 o'clock in the morning. It's interesting to compare David's view of the crucial moment when the Third Estate swore never to separate until France got a written constitution like the Americans had, to compare this with a painting of the Oath of the Horatii, because the gestures are exactly the same, which demonstrates either that life imitates art or that artists imitate themselves. At any rate, when the sitting was over, the administrative and political unity of France had been achieved, something that absolute monarchy had always tried and never managed to do. And the old regime was dead. On its grave, 3 weeks later, the Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man, full of echoes from America and more distant echoes of Locke and Rousseau. It might seem that by the end of August 1789, the French Revolution had been made, and that insofar as the public in London and Paris and Philadelphia was concerned, all was over but the cheering. Unfortunately, as you know, it wasn't over, because just as the king had played the Third Estate against the nobles, and the Third Estate had got the better of him, so the Third Estate, in order to get its way, raised up its own monster, and that was the people, the mob of Paris. Back on July the 14th, the Paris mob had stormed the Bastille, had torn it down, had set free the prisoners, had massacred the soldiers and the officers inside. It didn't matter that the old prison was practically empty, because its fall kept the reformers in power in the National Assembly. And then, while mobs rioted in urban France, peasant mobs had gone on the rampage in rural France as well, against the oppressive remains of the feudal system. This is the background of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And then in October 1789, the Paris mob, led and controlled by Paris market women, marched on Versailles. They massacred the king's guards. They brought the royal family back to Paris. The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy is what they called them. They brought the royal family out of their safe, splendid refuge into the capital of democracy. So the revolution had got out of hand. The National Assembly itself could not control it. And the snowball was about to become an avalanche, as we shall see next time. It started out with ringing words and heads held high. It ended up with grandiose slogans and heads cut off. It was meant to bring equality and liberty. Instead, it brought dictatorship and the new hierarchy of a great, powerful empire. The French Revolution, this time on the Western tradition. As we saw in our last program, the first years of the French Revolution were a fascinating time because everything seemed possible. An English poet, just 21 years old, William Wordsworth, goes to France in 1791. He falls in love with a young woman. He falls in love, with France, with a revolution. And this is what he has to say about it. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance. It was a fairy tale, a land of romance. But there was more than romance. There was enlightenment in action. There was history on the march. The revolution perfected what generations of kings and royal ministers had worked so hard to achieve and never managed to achieve. The revolution centralized France. It abolished particular laws, particular privileges, particular servitudes. No more different institutions in different provinces, no more internal customs barriers between provinces that hamper the circulation of people and goods. The revolution establishes one law, one court system, one administration, one bureaucracy, one set of rights and duties for all the French, which really means for all Frenchmen, because Roman precedent didn't give women much status. So at last, with some mitigations, reason was in power, or so it seemed. Reason gave France a constitution. It introduced representative government and universal suffrage, that is, universal male suffrage. It abolished the old provinces and divided the country into new areas called departments of reasonable size, with reasonable names like Loiret and Basse-Pyrénées, taken from a local river or mountain range. The revolution abolished the old system of weights and measures, which wasn't a system at all, but a jungle of different local measures. It introduced the metric system from the Greek word for measure. It created a new calendar with new months with wonderful names like Floréal and Thermidor and Fructidor, evocative of nature and of productive activities. And it replaced the 7-day week with 10-day periods, decades, so workers would only waste 3 days of rest a month instead of 4. It abolished the local languages and dialects like Flemish, Breton, Basque, and replaced them with one national language, French, which would be taught in schools to all children, not just to a privileged few. And it decreed that careers from now on would depend not on birth, but on talent, on a person's capacity and performance and merit. Unfortunately, most of these wonderful reforms remained on paper. Universal suffrage, public education, the generalization of the French language and of the metric system were all going to wait another 100 years. The reforms that did work, however, caused a great deal of trouble. Careers, at least for a while and up to a point, did open to talent, and that, of course, caused a good deal of friction. Even more troublesome was the problem of religious reform. Although the revolution didn't move against religion as such, you notice that Sunday disappeared from the new calendar, and people were also encouraged to abandon reactionary names of saints, of kings, to replace them with progressive names of heroes or of useful things, names like Brutus, Gracchus, Hector, or else cabbage, dandelion, carrot. And one of my colleagues has remarked that revolutionary names read rather like a seed catalogue. Moreover, the revolution represented religious tolerance. It removed restrictions against outcasts like actors or public executioners. More important, it emancipated Protestants, it emancipated Jews. Everybody was free to practice what religion they pleased, provided it didn't threaten the state. And that was hardly acceptable to good Catholics. What was much worse from the Catholic point of view was that the new state wanted to control the clergy even more than the old state had done. It confiscated church property and it put the clergy on salary, so priests became public employees. They had to swear a loyalty oath. They had to serve the state and not the Pope. And that was going to cause big trouble. The Pope forbade the clergy to swear allegiance to the state and the Constitution. Those who did swear were excommunicated, and that divided the French Church into a minority who took the oath to the state and a majority who refused and were imprisoned or exiled or forced into hiding. And it divided French citizens into those who obeyed the government and those who obeyed the Pope. Among these latter was Louis XVI, who had accommodated himself to all the other changes of the previous years. But the religious crisis prevented him from carrying out in practice the constitution he had sworn to uphold in theory, and in due course he was going to lose his head. And so was the Queen, both executed in the great square which Louis's grandfather helped design, and which is now called with a certain black humor, Place de la Concorde. At this point, the evolutionary change which revolution had simply accelerated was derailed, and France was torn wide open by a real violent revolution. The monarchy was done away with, the liberal constitution was jettisoned, dictatorship and terror took over. Where the first stage of the revolution had been liberal and not very violent, the second stage, which began around 1792, was illiberal, attempting to impose things on France that France wasn't prepared for. So it had to use force, and it had to use terror. Political freedom had to be protected by dictatorship. The revolution said that it stood for liberty and equality. But liberty and equality are very hard to reconcile because the exercise of liberty aggravates natural inequalities. Reason and tolerance are also hard to reconcile because reasoning can lead to intolerance, as it did when dogmatic rationalists went to war against priests in the name of reason. And dogmatic equalitarians went to war against rank, wealth, or any kind of distinction, even ability. So liberty and equality became victims of a revolution that was carried out in their name. The guillotine was an apt symbol for the situation in which well-meaning enthusiasts set out, as one of them said, to force people to be free. Remember, however, that no one set out deliberately to make life hell. The terror, as it was called, was the use of force or legal violence in order to make the world a better place. So it killed a few thousand people by execution, then it killed a few 100,000 in the civil wars it set off. And it also laid down such basic traditions for the future as fixed prices, which drove goods and especially food out of the market, a paper currency that quickly lost its value and gave paper money a bad name in France for the next 100 years, a police state to enforce its decrees and stifle criticism, a police state much tighter than the Inquisition ever managed to impose, and finally, recourse to foreign war in order to solve insoluble problems at home. France had to face what looked like the threat of reactionary foreign powers. In 1792, France mobilized an army of volunteers to fight Prussia and Austria. In 1793, the revolutionary government declared war on England, Holland, and Spain all in 1 month. On the other hand, the revolution had turned the country into a nation. It had declared that the French, who had been merely subjects of their king, were now citizens of a sovereign state, equal shareholders in the nation. That was a good thing, and it was going to pay dividends in the future. It meant that the sovereignty of the people was much more powerful and much more encroaching than the sovereignty of the king had ever been. It meant that the government which represented that sovereignty could raise more taxes than any king had ever done, and it meant that the state could mobilize not just the money of its citizens, but their bodies too. This is a French army recruitment post. Now, conscription wasn't new in Europe. The Swedes had used a sort of draft in the 30 Years' War, and Louis XIV's great war minister, Louvois, had tried to introduce it in France, although he had to drop the idea because of too much opposition. Then, Prussia perfected its system of regular military service for all healthy males, along with a reserve and with plans for general mobilization, which is how Prussia survived and prospered through the 18th century. By 1789, it kept nearly 200,000 men under arms, where the King of France could only manage 180,000, even though France was so much larger. And Prussia's 200,000 soldiers cost her just 1/3 of what France's smaller army cost. But by 1792, 3 years into the revolution, the French had gone to war with most of Europe, and they had requisitioned their own population en masse. By 1794, the French army was nearly 1 million strong, 5 times more than it had been 3 years before, and a new era had opened in military history, which we can fairly call the gunfodder era. The basic military formation of the old regime was the thin file of highly trained soldiers, 1, 2, 3 ranks. The basic military formation of the new regime would be the column, a massive thing well adapted to a lot of ill-trained conscripts who have to be kept together under fire. It was all very understandable, but the fact remains that no general of the old regime would have dreamed to throw his men in heavy columns like this under the enemy fire. The thin file did not produce decisive results, but it spared the men, and the men were hard to get, and they were expensive to recruit, expensive to train. But the generals of the revolution and later of the empire, spent their men without counting the losses. They knew that the state could always get more for them because it saw the whole French nation as a reservoir, and the reservoir was free. It's possible that the large-scale massacres which followed were connected with a revival of the idea of total war, an idea that the 18th century had forgotten. The difficulties of 1793 brought about not only the mobilization of men, but also, as you've heard, the mobilization of civilians of all ages and sexes, and the attempt to control national resources in a way that had never been seen before. The difference between the total war which the French invented rather casually in the 1790s and the total war which we dread today in the 1980s, though it's very great, is only a matter of degree. And once again we are faced with this curious paradox that something which started so hopefully and with such excellent intentions as the French Revolution did should produce such extraordinary and terrifying results. The victories of revolutionary generals, for example, were facilitated by the fact that they abandoned all the accepted rules and inhibitions and conventions of warfare as warfare had been conceived in the 18th century. And that made warfare much, much worse. The destructive wars of the 17th century had led to the devising of a system of limited warfare in the 18th century, formalizing the conduct of war, limiting its destructiveness both for soldiers and for civilians. But the French generals now abandoned this. First, because of necessity. They were fighting everybody at once and they didn't have time for niceties. Second, because they didn't care about the established order, about the established code. They violated borders, they fomented revolutions, they lived off the country, and they moved much faster. They ignored all the nice, comfortable conventions, and so they reintroduced the old, ruthless practices into current use. And eventually their enemies would adopt them too. The French saw themselves engaged in a great world struggle for the liberation of peoples from the yoke of dynastic tyrannies. They pledged war to the castles, peace to the cottages, war against the oppressors for the oppressed. They declared that they would assist every people that wanted to be free. Depending on how you look at it, this was a blank check for rebellion or an imperialistic provocation against the other powers of Europe. But it turned out that some populations didn't want to be liberated or didn't want to adopt the institutions the French thought they should adopt. Such people had to be freed of their inhibitions. They needed French guides and commissars and occupiers to teach them to be free, just as the French themselves had had to be taught. And so here you had the ideology and the practice of national revolution, in which revolutionary disorder became revolutionary dictatorship, and wars of national liberation became wars of national imperialism. Another instance of how the revolution perfected what generations of French kings had worked for but had never accomplished. All this culminated under the leadership of a dictator of genius, a great general, and a great administrator, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon began his career as an artillery officer, just on the eve of the revolution and just in time to take advantage of the opportunities that the revolution and its wars held out. His rise was meteoric. At 24 in 1793, he's already a general. In 1795 and 96, he crushes the Austrian and Sardinian armies, and before long, all of Italy and Switzerland had fallen under French domination as well. In 1799, at 30 years old, he is the most powerful man in France. He issues a new constitution. Essentially, he imposes one-man rule. And by 1804, he has crowned himself emperor. Napoleon tried to emulate Alexander the Great, and he almost succeeded. Under his rule, the French conquered or dominated Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic. For a few years, there were French kings or princes in Madrid and Naples and Dubrovnik and Stockholm and Münster and Florence. France ruled the continent while England ruled the waves. And this empire only fell to pieces when the French overextended themselves and invaded Russia, after which Napoleon was defeated more by the Russian winter than by his enemies. But Napoleon was also the last and greatest of the enlightened despots. Great general that he was, his greatest work was the Civil Code, which we now know as the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that gave permanent form to the gains of the revolution. Individual liberty, freedom to work, freedom of conscience, equality before the law. The Civil Code was in the tradition of liberal humanism that we've seen operating since the Renaissance, with its interest in the individual and its lack of interest in women, regarded as mere machines for making children and second-class citizens at best. The victories of Napoleon's armies prepared the way for the victories of the Napoleonic Code and also prepared the way for the evolution of the people occupied by the French towards individual freedom. Napoleon's armies acted as a catalyst. Wherever they passed, they destroyed what was left of feudal institutions, they abolished serfdom, they emancipated Jews, they brought in freedom of enterprise. Before Napoleon, individual freedom found its limits on the Rhine. By 1812, these limits had advanced roughly to a line from Denmark to Bavaria and then south to the Adriatic, which happens also to be the line dividing free Western Europe from the communist world today. But having freed these people from their old regime, having fed them on liberal ideas, having taught them to think in these new French ways, Napoleon produced a result he had not intended. He gave them the idea of national sovereignty and national self-determination. The idea that if they were free as individuals under the law, they should also be politically free, under a state which they chose themselves, not one imposed by the French. In spite of himself, the conqueror became the instrument of a political liberation and a political liberalism he had not intended to bring. The wars to bring fraternal aid brought occupation, but it's obvious that neither the revolution nor its wars, with the tons of human flesh they wasted, that none of these were quite in vain. They propagated the modern idea of national sovereignty. They proclaimed that all men have rights. Women, unfortunately, took a bit longer, and in France, the home of the Napoleonic Code, very much longer indeed. They prepared the way for lower classes to enter political life. They suggested totalitarian methods and ideas that the 20th century was going to copy with enthusiasm. And they set out an agenda that we are still working out today. In our next program, we shall look at another very different kind of revolution that also changed the world, the Industrial Revolution. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.